Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 350. And this time I'm going to feature this record by Chick Corea, Return to Forever, which originally came out in 1972 on ECM, and this is a first German pressing. Regular viewers of this channel will know that I am fairly selective when it comes to 70s jazz fusion, but this is one Return to Forever record, which I really dig. Why? Well, because I find it to be mellow, it's trippy, it's cosmic, it's got some great Latin influences. It's laid back. It isn't the kind of tuneless, self-absorbed, wild-ass jazz rock which turns me off. I like it for a lot of the reasons that I like Alice Coltrane or Pharoah Sanders, even though their music is really quite different from this. If you're partial to the groovy sound of the Fender Rhodes piano, well, this is a record for you. Likewise, the percussion on here is superb. The sound and the overall vibe are incredible. It's one of the great accessible portals to the world of 70s jazz fusion. Armando "Chick" Corea was born in the Greater Boston area in June 1941. His father immigrated from Italy. He clearly had no difficulty assimilating to his new culture because by the 1930s he was playing in a Dixieland band. So Chick is born into a very jazz-friendly house. He has plenty of exposure to the bebop generation. He also came to dig in his early years the Latin jazz sounds that people like Dizzy Gillespie were working to import. By 8 years of age, Chick was taking piano lessons, and he also developed a bit of a side hustle as a drummer. In his early teens, he formed a trio and he began to gig around the greater Boston area. He was very much influenced, in particular, by the music of Horace Silver, and this was the kind of music that Chick was playing in and around Back Bay. When he graduated from high school, Chick moved to New York City to study music at Columbia, but he found that to be kind of disappointing. So he moved to Juilliard, which he also found kind of disappointing, likely for some of the same reasons that led Miles Davis to be put off, and that he couldn't really learn the kind of music that he wanted to play at music programs which were rather more traditionally oriented. So he drops out and he decides to immerse himself in becoming a professional jazz musician in New York. And the first serious gig he gets is with Cab Calloway. That wasn't really what you might call future-oriented music, with all due respect to Cab. And so Chick then starts to move into Latin jazz. He gets work with some real legends of Latin jazz, Mongo Santamaria and Willie Bobo. And it's in the early 1960s that he first starts to appear on recordings, primarily but not exclusively with either Latin or Latin conversant jazz musicians. His first credit is on Mongo Santamaria's record Go Mongo in 1962, and in the next few years, he'd record with Blue Mitchell, with Hubert Laws, Herbie Mann, Stan Getz, and even Dizzy himself. In 1966, he records as a leader for the first time for the somewhat experimental boutique jazz label called Vortex, some of whose artists would eventually go on to record for ECM. That record is enigmatically titled Tones for Jones Bones, and it's made with some other quite forward-looking musicians like Joe Farrell, with whom he'd collaborate quite a lot, and the bassist Steve Swallow. It's really good. It feels quite post-bop, feels quite ahead of its time. It wasn't released, however, until 1968, and if you listen to it, the progressive nature of the music that Chick was playing and its alignment with the work that Miles was doing with his second quintet is pretty clear. That same year, in 1968, he puts out a second record as a leader with a trio with Roy Haynes and Miroslav Vitas called Now He Sings, Now He Sobs on Solid State Records. Meanwhile, in Miles Davis's world, his second great quintet was starting to come apart at the seams. Two-thirds of the rhythm section, Herbie Hancock and Tony Williams on piano and drums respectively, were making noises about wanting to leave. They'd been recording as leaders, they wanted to try something new. Ron Carter, the third member of the rhythm section, the bassist, had been getting tired of all the touring that Miles was doing and was doing a lot of session work, which was quite lucrative and was often not available for dates. In the summer of 1968, Miles ends up with a booking at Count Basie's club in New York. Ron Carter said he was already booked, couldn't make those dates, so Miles replaces him with Dave Holland, drafting him in as a replacement, not necessarily permanently, but it pretty soon became permanent. Herbie ends up playing the dates at Count Basie's, but then immediately afterwards goes off and gets married and goes to Brazil on his honeymoon, where he gets food poisoning and some kind of liver ailment. He is resting up in hospital. Miles wants him to come back and play. Herbie says he can't, I'm sick. Miles doesn't really believe him. It's not really clear who had more of a case there. I'm presuming it was Herbie, but in any event, Miles then says, okay, let's get somebody else in. Phones up Chick Corea, says, can you come and sit in? Loved his work and basically gives him the job, Herbie's job, right then and there as a replacement. And through this happenstance, Chick ends up on a whole bunch of records which bridge Miles's acoustic and electric periods. And those are, of course, Feed to Kilimanjaro, In a Silent Way, Bitches Brew, and On the Corner. And as much as Miles, of course, influences everybody he plays with, you could make a good case that Chick really influenced Miles's sound at the time. His own sonic experimentation with electric piano in particular is a big part of Miles's evolution. Chick then leaves Miles in 1970 along with Dave Holland to form a free jazz and fusiony outfit Circle. They were joined by the sax player Anthony Braxton, he of the subsequent song titles which seem to be written in scientific notation, the drummer Barry Altschul, and together as Circle they released 3 records which are pretty out there in jazz terms, though I guess very much their time. Most of the stuff they released is live in concert. That lasts for about a year, and then Chick decides to take his own work in a more accessible direction. The Return to Forever band reunites Chick with a number of former connections. These include Joe Farrell, the sax and flute player, with whom Chick had played on and off really for, I think, 6 or 7 years at this point, and had also recorded with him as a sideman, and the Brazilian percussionist and fellow Miles Davis alumni, Airto. Airto also brought his wife into the band, the singer Flora Purim, and the whole group was rounded out with the young bass player Stanley Clarke. That this group came together at all, however, has to do with, of all people, Stan Getz. Recall that in the 1960s, Corea had backed up Getz as a sideman, most notably on Getz's 1967 record, Sweet Rain. They kept in touch, and in and around 1971, Chick had a side project working for Getz, pulling together music for a project of Getz's which would eventually be called Captain Marvel. He was pulling together a backing band and also doing some compositions. Some of those compositions actually end up on here and not on the Getz record. The backing band he got together included Tony Williams, formerly of Miles Davis's group, and Airto, but he needed a bass player, and he bumps into a young guy called Stanley Clarke, who was planning on becoming the first ever black double bassist in the Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra. Chick persuades Clarke instead to come and join the Getz project, and he and Airto and Clarke enjoy playing together so much they decide to form their own band as a side project, with Farrell coming in on reeds and Flora coming in on vocals. The band comes to take the name of the first album they recorded, Return to Forever. The tracks for this record were recorded on February 2nd and 3rd, 1972 at A&R Studios in Manhattan. Tony May is the engineer, and Manfred Eicher, of course, is the producer. Eicher, of course, is the owner and visionary behind ECM and has been since its founding. For ECM, Corea and his involvement here represented a fairly marquee signing, one of 2 real, banner names which carried the label's fortunes in its early years, along with Keith Jarrett. Side 1 has 3 of the 4 tracks in the album, and it starts with the title track, Return to Forever. Chick has this great sense of not hurrying his playing, and maybe he learned some of that from Miles, but you can detect it in his earlier work as well. Flora is wonderful here. Chick is very selective about when to use her vocals and when not, very much to good effect. It's overall a lovely ensemble piece, and what emerges here is certainly jazz, but not really jazz as we've known it very often in the past in 1972. It's something of a soundscape. The next track is Crystal Silence, probably my favorite track on the record. I absolutely love this. It is, I think, just a duet between Farrell and Corea. It is just beautiful. The last track on side 1, What Game Should We Play Today, is a very cool little number. It's a playful little tune and a very airy little vocal from Flora, but it gets a little bit of grit from these funky little tones and notes that Chick slides in there at the end of some phrases on his Rhodes. Very subtle contrasts make this track really interesting, and it really works. Side 2 is totally taken up with one track some time ago, which occupies some 23 minutes of recorded time. There's too much to sum up on this track. I'm not going to give you a blow by blow. Nobody needs that. But I will say that I gained a whole new appreciation for both Airto and Stanley Clarke after hearing this. I've said this before in other contexts on this channel, but I do wish that after Miles Davis had made In a Silent Way, that this was the direction he had tended towards instead of the direction he took. It's hard to single anybody out in particular because it's such a great ensemble performance. Flora gets less time in the spotlight, but her cameos are really done to good effect. Chick's piano work, of course, is excellent. Joe Farrell brings incredible variety and multi-instrumentality. And I love Stanley Clarke's bass work. This record is very rewarding. It almost makes me wonder what other fusion from the 70s I'm missing out on. And for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.